Hello, hello everyone. Thank you for coming. Can you hear me? Wait a minute. Okay, thank you very much for coming. I want to talk today about one aspect of the Nubians that I noticed, and that is um, the tourism that they experienced. Uh, Now, I lived in the village of West Aswan, as you know, and I did research for several times. Living in the hamlet or the neja of which is called Gubba. Now this is before the Arab Spring and before COVID. So remember that what I'm talking about happened some time ago, and I'm hoping to go back eventually and continue my research. The Nubians who live in the village of West Aswan have been welcoming tourists to their village for several decades. Visitors have been coming to the west bank of the Nile for more than a century in order to see the pharaonic tombs and the monastery of St. Simeon, and the Nubians have been meeting tourists there in order to offer aid and advice, or just out of curiosity, for almost as long. It was not until the high dam was built in the 1960s, however, that the tourist industry in Aswan began to bloom. Tourists now come to Aswan by airplane, train, tour bus, cruise ship, and hired car. They come to see the tombs, Abu Simbel, Philae, the High Dam, the Aswan Archaeological Museum, the Nubian Museum, and the Nubian villages. Several new hotels have been constructed since the mid-1980s in order to accommodate the rapidly expanding tourist industry. In 1986, there were 30 to 40 tourist cruise ships sailing up and down the Nile between Luxor and Aswan, the largest of which carried 200 people. By 2007, there were even more. In the past, tour groups have been brought to private homes in the village where they were welcomed and served karkade, which is hibiscus, or tea with mint by the women who lived there. These women invited these tour groups into their homes, and they took them on tours of their large and spacious homes, or they allowed the tourists to actually walk around on their own, looking into the various rooms. They tried to sell them bags and caps, which they had crocheted, and they hoped to receive ample tips from the tourists. They also received a percentage of the fee that the tour groups paid to the tour leader. Now, women could also be seen in the central square trying to sell their handcrafted goods to the tourists there. The first time that I paid close attention to the tourist trade in the village was in 1986, when I counted the number of tourists coming to the village monthly. December of that year was the heaviest month, with a total of 400 tourists visiting. The women who were involved in tourism made the equivalent of about $68 per month, which was a considerable sum for a village woman at that time. The money which they made was theirs to spend as they wished, and they generally used it to buy school books and clothing for their children, and to increase the property values of their homes by steadily enlarging them. When I returned to the village in 1997, I saw that the tourist trade had increased in importance and even more tourists were visiting. This increase was obviously good for the economy of the village. People were wearing nicer clothing, eating better food, and building new houses. These houses now had tiled floors and walls, glass windows, air conditioning, large kitchens with Western-style stoves and refrigerators, and bathrooms with toilets and showers. However, it had also become obvious to all by then that the thousands of tourists who had been walking through the village and through their homes over the years were quite intrusive and disruptive to village life. When I last visited West Aswan in 2007, I saw that the villagers were attempting to exercise some control over the amount and direction of tourist traffic there. Groups had been rerouted away from the central square and taken by camel to new locations. One of these was a large tent set up in the desert to the west of the village, where tour groups were served tea and entertained by musicians and dancers. They were given an opportunity to buy Nubian-made bags and necklaces, as well as Egyptian galabeas and costume jewelry from the owner of the tent. Unlike in the past, women did not approach the tourists with their individually crafted items. In addition, certain families in the village had built structures which they called a Beit Nubi, literally a Nubian house. They used this label to designate certain houses that, although they were newly built, they looked like the older, more traditional Nubian home, with its thick mud brick walls and several rooms opening up off a central sandy-floored courtyard. Walls are painted inside and out with scenes of village life, such as women weaving basket lids or pharaonic designs. This in itself differentiates the Beit Nubi from a regular Nubian home, which generally has Islamic verses written on the walls and very rarely depictions of human beings. Tourists are encouraged to look into each of the rooms, which have walls hung with the black overdress that Nubian women wear, jarjars, and colorful hand-woven basket lids, and tourists are allowed to take photographs. There are tables set up in the courtyards laden with necklaces, baskets, t-shirts, Egyptian-made porcelain mugs, and other souvenirs which the tourists are encouraged to buy. As with the tent I mentioned earlier, I saw no village women approach the tourists in a Beit Nubi with their own wares for sale. Now there are several other Beit Nubi in West Aswan, including one that is being run as a cafe and is surrounded by campgrounds on which tour groups can stay. Other families rent out a room in their Beit Nubi in which tourists can stay overnight, something that was actually forbidden by law when I last stayed there. Yet another Beit Nubi is situated on the Nile in the village of West Sahel, which is west of Aswan, south and west of Aswan, positioned so that tour groups can approach it by boat. It was obviously built so that visitors could sit around drinking tea and gazing at the river while considering the purchase of one of the many souvenirs hanging on the walls of the structure. Despite its several rooms nicely decorated with old Nubian domestic articles, this Beit Nubi looks more like a bazaar than it does like a home. But tourists cannot be expected to know that. It has just enough touches of the traditional to make it seem exotic to foreigners, yet enough of the domestic so that it can appear to be a real Nubian house. Now, admittedly, the sample is small, but it's interesting to speculate if this part of the tourist trade is slowly being taken out of the hands of village women. In 1986, in 1992, and again in 1997, I saw hundreds of tourists walking through the village, being led to 10 to 12 village houses. In 2007, I only saw 2 women dealing with the tourists in their family homes. The rest of the tourists were being taken to these Beit Nubi. On this last visit, it appeared to me that the handling of tourists had become more structured and more male-dominated, as all of the Beit Nubi that I saw at the time had been organized and run by men. Men had always been the more important actors in terms of bringing tourists to the village, because the boatmen were all men. But in the past, they had relinquished this control once the groups were in the village houses. Now it seemed that they were continuing to maintain control over the tour groups, even inside the home, although it was an artificial home. When I noticed this change, I began to speculate on the reasons for such a situation. The Beit Nubi were built as a way to control the crowds of tourists who visited West Aswan every year, and who could be quite intrusive and overwhelming to a small community. And the tourists were really intrusive. In addition, the act of bringing large numbers of strangers into the so-called private sphere of the home, a surprising departure from the commonly understood public-private dichotomy of the Muslim worldview, is now perhaps less tolerated by the villagers as it once was. The Beit Nubi are presented to tourists as a way for them to peek into the private world of the home without really allowing them to do so. That the Beit Nubi prevent women from earning money directly from tourism, as they did in the past, may be an unintended consequence of the attempt to regain the security and tranquility of village life. Now, although it appeared to me that village men were taking over the tourist trade in every respect, informants assured me that things were not quite that simple. Yes, some men were assuming roles that the wives had previously occupied, but for several different reasons. There were those men who had been working in Saudi Arabia and had absorbed the attitudes of Wahhabism concerning women's roles. They indeed refused to allow their wives to continue in the tourist trade. These men, uncomfortable with the thought of large groups of strangers entering the privacy of their homes, were the reason that some women had discontinued their involvement. Other men, however, had been unable to find steady employment in Aswan after returning from working in the Gulf or Saudi Arabia. Building a Beit Nubi with the money earned abroad was a way to support their families by partaking more thoroughly of the lucrative offerings that tourism affords. These men interacted with tour groups far more than they had before, but not necessarily because they were against women acting in the public domain, but because they wanted to make money without being dependent upon their wives. I was assured, however, that there were still several males in the village who were sanguine about their wives' involvement in tourism. They still considered the home to be the woman's domain, and they said that they believed that a woman had the right to do what she wanted within her sphere. Now, these men had steady jobs, so they were not threatened by their wives' business pursuits, nor were they dependent upon them. Instead, they were pleased to have the extra income. Now, those scholars who are interested in tourism have noted that relationships between men and women in communities that are affected by the tourist trade change owing to the pressures that result from the increase of income in these communities. In some places, women's status seems to have improved, but in others, the extra income brought in by women results in little economic improvement or empowerment for the women themselves. Researchers who are interested in the status of women in Muslim societies have argued that traditionally male and female domains were considered equally important to the welfare of the family unit. They hypothesize that as long as the woman's domain continues to be perceived as valuable, women's contributions to the family will be considered valuable. When the female sphere is devalued, however, so will their work be, no matter how hard they work or how much money they make. In the 1980s, when I first began my research, it appeared to me that the villagers in West Aswan, both male and female, acknowledged the importance of the female domain and the activities of the women within that domain. In the first edition of my book, I suggested that because men in West Aswan were making more and more money from their jobs in the Gulf states and in Saudi Arabia, the balanced and complementary nature of the contribution of the sexes was becoming skewed, and that women who sought to earn their money from tourism were acting to maintain that balance. I argued that the money that women made in the tourist trade enabled them to maintain the importance of the female domain in the estimation of their fellow villagers, because they used the money not only for their children, but also to enlarge and improve the quality of the family home. These actions are openly acknowledged by the villagers as the right as well as the duty of the woman of the house. My most recent visit showed me, however, that some males are encroaching upon the territory that was previously considered the woman's domain, not for selfish or sexist reasons, but under economic duress. The female sphere, rather than becoming devalued, appears to have become a more desirable locus of potential wealth than it had been in the past. Access to this particular female sphere activity seems to be of superior value to some males. Now that's where I ended, but I had some questions for future research, which I never really got to do because the Arab Spring intervened in 2011, and that cut down on tourism to the area. And then came COVID, leading to fewer and fewer visitors. But my questions for future research are these. If the Nubi continue and become more successful, will women eventually, will they be edged out eventually of the tourist trade, and women's work will be redefined by the visitors to exclude working with tourists? Or will village women be able to hold their own as a result of the positive regard that Nubians continue to feel towards the female domain? Now, what I'd like to do next is show you some slides, just a few slides of the houses that I was talking about, so you have a general idea of what I was talking about. Now I have to find. Okay, I'm going to try to get these photographs if I can. Okay, hold on for a minute. Okay, can you see these slides?
Yes, Dr. And it's loading. And I think everyone can see it now.
Okay, good. Okay, here we go. This is a slide, it's an overview of one of the villages in West Aswan. And you'll see that the walls of the houses are thick and they're made from mud brick, which has been dried in the sun. And then the walls are constructed and then they're uh, painted over with whitewash. And you will also notice the barrel vault ceilings, which helps with the breezes. Okay, this is one of the older houses. And you notice that again, the walls are whitewashed. They're not painted. And here is the bench that when people at the end of the day, they come out of their houses and they sit around on these mastabas and tunas, as Shukri mentioned last week. Now, inside one of these houses, you see the sandy floor courtyard here, and each one of these doors is the entrance to a room, usually a bedroom. And tourists at the time were encouraged to go in and out of these homes just to see what the bedrooms looked like. And they were encouraged to walk around inside of these homes, which generally strangers don't enter. Here's another view of one of the Nubian houses, which earned quite a lot of money from the tourists. The woman who owned this house had an understanding with tour groups, and so tour leaders would bring their tour groups to her house, and they'd sit around inside the house drinking tea or karkade and hopefully buying some of the things that had been crocheted by the women. Another view of the house. You see how large it is. And surprising, a lot of tourists didn't realize that Nubian houses look like this. Another view. This is my favorite house. I really like this house. The older houses generally didn't have a lot of pictures of human beings, but they had verses from the Quran and a picture of Al-Barak, who took Muhammad to heaven on her back, as I recall. This is what some of the newer houses look like. You see, they look very different. They look more like American houses, which is what Nubians said that they preferred. Another one, you see pharaonic designs on the walls instead of Quranic verses. And again, this is another house that accepted tour groups into their house at the time, and may still. I'm not really sure what's going on now with them. Another view of a new house. And this is one of the houses that tourists or foreigners could rent out, as a matter of fact, and stay for a bit, sort of like an Airbnb. This is the house that I was talking about earlier. The man who bought this house decided to turn it into a cafe. So tour groups could come in and sit in the cafe and drink tea and all that. And this is the last slide. This one, an older house, but was made into a restaurant for tourists. I think that's it. All right, that's it. I hope that you have questions for me.
Yes, Dr. Ann. First of all, I like to introduce myself to you. I'm Mazen, an admin from Nubian Geographic Group, who is living in Aswan, and I'm quite familiar with some of these houses already that some of my friends own. Okay, I was just
Yes,
trying
good.
to ask something like, the Nubian main craft was agriculture. Like Nubians
Mm,
were known through history as farmers. Okay,
mm-hmm.
do you think that tourism shifted the way of Nubian and how they live, especially after the displacement due to the building of dam, Aswan Dam, the first Aswan Dam, and the second one, the High Dam?
Mm-hmm. Are you still there? Did you
Just
mute
put on
yourself?
mute in order
Oh,
to not having
okay.
an echo when you speak.
Mm-hmm. Oh, you muted yourself again.
I can rephrase the question. Okay. I
Okay.
was telling that Nubians known to be farmers, like
Uh-huh.
through the contemporary history, Nubians known to own land and palm trees. So being having a Nubian village in Aswan, okay, whereas Aswan is a touristic place, do you think that tourism helped it to shift the main craft of Nubians from being farmers to be like in the industry of hospitality?
Oh, you're asking me that question?
Yes.
Well, remember that the Nubians have for centuries, the men have gone away because they were farmers, but there wasn't really enough land for them to farm to raise their families. So they had to go to Cairo or to Alexandria, or in the ancient times, they joined army and fought for the pharaohs in order to make enough money to raise their children, to bring home for their families. So they've always gone out of Nubia. And I guess tourism was a way for them to be able to stay in Nubia, in their villages, with their families. I was really hoping that they could find some other way to make money because, well, you see what happened. After the Arab Spring, tourists stopped coming to Nubia. So they became very poor again. And then COVID hit, again, tourists stopped coming to Nubia. So I just don't know what's going on right now. You probably know better than I do. You've been there, right? You're living there now.
Yes, I'm living in Aswan, but in the city, in the east of Aswan, not in Gharb Aswan or west of Aswan.
Mm-hmm.
And I can say that the first Naga, El Gobba,
Mm-hmm.
is much like the touristic place or the touristic part of Gharb Aswan, while the rest of Nubia are working in some other jobs or have another sort of working, as maybe some of them are farmers, some of them are like officials in the government. But I think the tourist part in Gharb Aswan was just exclusive to Naga Al Gobba.
Mm-hmm.
And after a while, the most of like what we call it here is Nubian tourists have been shifted to Gharb Hill, if you're familiar with this village.
Yes.
So during your statement in Gharb Aswan, I think Gharb Aswan was like the first destination for the tourists to come to see or to live the Nubian life. But I think
Mm.
after the modernization of the village of Garbus Hill, okay, most of tourists like like to go to Garbus Hill because it's wider and the place that the tourist can visit is much bigger than Gharb Aswan, because you're going to know in Gharb Aswan you just have the Nobel tombs and Abu Hawa
Mm.
Spring. So I think Gharbis Hill now is leading the tourist destination part in Aswan right now. And for sure, after the Arab Spring and after COVID, people start to realizing that tourism industry is not so reliable to have like as your main income during all the year.
Mm-hmm. So they're looking for some other way to make money?
Actually, like they are trying to recover from after COVID-19, okay?
Yeah.
Because as you know that tourism here in Aswan is just seasonal
Mm-hmm.
for just winter, for just 3 months.
Mm-hmm.
And the majority or even the category of the tourism itself, it shifted like in all the days or in the past, you can see that most of the people who are visiting Aswan from Germany or from France, but nowadays you can have local Egyptian or the majority are local Egyptian.
Oh, good.
So yes, so that's good for sure. Like because we as the Nubian, we like to have a better comprehension from the Egyptian side, because most of people when they think about Aswan, they think it is very remote from Cairo or not even related to Egypt. But people start to realize that Aswan and Luxor are the essence of Egypt and the essence of this civilization at first place. So even it is not like economically as much as the tourists will pay or the tourists or foreign tourists will spend money here in Aswan, but from other way, it have its own benefits also.
Yeah. Yeah. Good. Okay. Does anyone else have any questions or would like to say something about the Nubians? Yeah, Marcus.
It's Marco speaking here. Thank you, and for your presentation. And thank you for the Nubian Geographic Administrator. I don't know what is your name, for your comments. I really would like to know, how is it changing for Nubians that the main visitors were from Europe and now they are from Egypt? Are they able to make financially the same input? What is the interest of Egyptians in Nubia? And where's the interest of Egyptians in Nubia different from the interest in Nubia by Europeans? So maybe if you could, maybe UN or the administrator could elaborate more on this topic, please.
Good question. Very good question, Marcus. Would anybody like to contribute? You've got to
hello, this is Maher. Try to answering, or if it was a question for Marcus about something like comparing between the Egyptian tourism or tourism from Europe or outside of Egypt. During the Arab Spring and the COVID, there was encouragement from the government for locals to go to Luxor and Aswan just to make things going in how it was before. And by the way, the Egyptian is paying the same fees for these guest houses. Most of these guest houses now is in Airbnb or Booking.com. It's the same price. There is no price for Egyptian or price for tourists. It's the same. When they book it through the app. So they paying the same money. I think there is comparing about amount of Egyptian and tourists, even during the high season. It's about maybe 60% of Egyptian and 40 for the tourists. which coming
Mm.
from outside of Egypt. But
Mhm.
it's seasonal for tourists from out. It's sometimes it's the amount is different. Usually in mid-year, all people is having vacation, so there is hundreds of Egyptian in at Aswan and Luxor, specifically at Nubian villages like West Aswan, but mostly at Gharb Sahel and Elephantine Island. And now it's joining to this Marathon Hesa Island, and what's make it more accurate that every village when they started, they didn't start it from the beginning. They saw which the first village stopped, and they start from what let's say what Gharb Sahel, what West Aswan stopped in. So Gharb Sahel started from this point, and Hesa is taking the lead. This is like personal experience as someone who live in Aswan, and as a tour guide. I'm also having a guest houses I rented through Airbnb and Booking.com. So I am in this industry, and I cannot say that it's, this is my point of